there's a lot of talk about Trump losing, which I believe he will, and not leaving. He's already said, he's telegraphed, he's going to take it to the courts. He just got shot down in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia court rejected the Republicans' latest effort to block ballots. In Texas, the Supreme Court there denied the GOP-led petition seeking to invalidate nearly 127,000 votes. I would be pissed off if if I cast a vote and you denied it. All over the country, people they are fighting to get votes not counted. And Trump said at his last rally, everything should be counted. It's going to be unfair if it's not counted by Tuesday. It's unfair that they should, So he's setting it up for some shenanigans. I asked you off mic, have we ever had a time when a president wouldn't leave office who lost?
The quick answer to that question is no. That's never happened before. But like so many things in politics right now, a lot of things have never happened before. So I want to first of all say hello to Drew again. It's a pleasure to be on with Drew again. And I also want to say before we start talking too much, Karen, I know you just were talking about the extraordinary work. You both were talking about the extraordinary work that Stacey Abrams has done. But I know somebody who's been talking about election and voting for a long time. And I'm talking about Karen Hunter, because we've been talking about this together for a long time. Party of Lincoln, how important this is, going back for a long time. So you have been such an important voice on this question. So I want to express my gratitude to you as well. With that being said, one more small point that Drew said about the lifestyle of voting. I mean, you could also call it the habit of voting. We do a bad job every 4 years. Maybe a good year, it's 60%. Typically, it's 50%. Half of the country who's eligible to vote doesn't vote every 4 years. In the off years elections, it goes down to 40%. So we do a terrible job of this in our country for a very, very long time. And this suppression of vote, the suppression numbers, this did not happen in the last 3 years or 4 years. This has been a strategy for a very, very long time, particularly in the Republican Party. So there are some long-term trends here that we have to be worried about. And yes, democracy does not die in darkness. Drew mentioned before, democracy is on the ballot here. It is. I believe that. I believe that our democracy has been under attack for a long time in this country. That's one of the reasons I wrote Strong Man. I wanted to show from history how quickly this can happen. Mussolini came to power 98 years ago. He was elected. He was a member of the parliament. He was made the prime minister. Within a year, the fascist party was a one-party state. A few years later, Hitler does the same thing. Hitler was put into office under a constitutional democracy. And very, very quickly, both of these men dismantled all of these rights. So this is a very important part of history we must understand, because it couldn't happen here. Now, to your question, no, it's never happened that a president didn't leave. The opposite ones happened. One of the most interesting and important elections in history was in 1800. And it's important because it obviously was the election that put Thomas Jefferson in power, and it was a very controversial election. But right up until the end, it went. They didn't have a winner because they counted the Electoral College differently that day. In those days, it used to be that you voted for two names. The winner, the most electoral votes, became president. The second place finisher became vice president. So George Washington, of course, became president. John Adams became his vice president. Adams is elected in 1796. Thomas Jefferson, by then they were no longer pals who wrote the Declaration of Independence together. They were political rivals. Thomas Jefferson becomes Adams's vice president. An extraordinary moment, of course, is transition of power. George Washington is the outgoing president, John Adams the incoming president, and Thomas Jefferson, the losing candidate, becomes the vice president in 1796. It must have been an extraordinary moment, those three all in the same place. 4 years later, in 1800, Adams actually loses the election even though it hasn't actually been decided. And he leaves early. So rather than staying around too long, he actually left early. Some people thought it was, not very polite to have done that. His son did the same thing a few years later, John Quincy Adams. But no, American tradition has been this peaceful transition of power. And just like we have never had a strongman, a military dictator, a tyrant come to power in this country, even in our worst crises, we've always had a peaceful transition of power. It hasn't always been polite, hasn't always been friendly, but it has been peaceful and orderly for the most part.
What was the worst handing over of power? The closest to unpeaceful?
Well, I have to say in 1800, it's always been peaceful. In 1800, because of the way the Electoral College was structured at the time and the separate voting for president and vice president, there was no clear winner. There was a tie in the Electoral College between Thomas Jefferson and his, we would call it running mate today. They weren't really running mates. They were just running in the same party, Aaron Burr, the rather notorious Aaron Burr. Jefferson, because of dealings behind the scenes, was supposed to win by a vote, and then Burr would become his vice president. But they finished in a tie, and Jefferson always thought that Burr was the one who sort of finagled this somehow. But this went on. The election, of course, was in November into December. It went on for months, and they were really worried that they were not going to have a decision because it went to the House of Representatives to decide. And they took many, many votes in the House of Representatives before deciding that Thomas Jefferson would be the president. And Aaron Burr, the second-place finisher, becomes his vice president. Of course, a few years later, for everyone who's
there's a
been
duel,
to Broadway
right?
And seen.
Is there a duel?
Everyone, that's right. Everyone who's been to Hamilton knows how this story ends. Aaron Burr, while he's the sitting vice president of the United States of America, kills Alexander Hamilton in a duel across the river from me in Weehawken, New Jersey. Of course, Hamilton at that point was the former Secretary of the Treasury, but one of the most significant political figures in America at that time. And I hope I haven't spoiled it for anyone who hasn't seen Hamilton yet, but that's pretty much the history of it. So Burr, who's the sitting vice president, talk about violence, goes back to Washington, D.C., and he actually then presides over an impeachment trial of a Supreme Court judge and considered to have done a very good job at that. But that was really the end of his political career. Jefferson later charges him with treason. That's another very complicated story. But no, we've never had this, a moment where any president in history has questioned either the legitimacy of the election or questioned the validity of an election. There was one case that was close. Richard Nixon in 1960, when Richard Nixon ran against John F. Kennedy, the race was very, very close. There were even some questions about disputed votes in Chicago.
Chicago, mob town.
Yeah, and mob and also Mayor Richard Daley, who was a real kingmaker at that time. And so there were some questions, and people talked to Nixon about disputing the vote, and he actually, is in what may have been the most noble moment of his life, of his political life, said, "No, we're going to go with this. And then he went back to California, of course, became president 8 years later. So that was about as close as we've ever come to a sticky situation. We have had other elections that were very, very sticky and considered fraudulent that went to either a commission or were questionable. And they're interesting elections. The first was in 1876, a really important election in American history. 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican nominee. Samuel Tilden is the Democratic nominee, a governor of New York. Tilden won the popular vote. There were disputed votes in the Electoral College. Guess where they came from? Florida. They had a commission to settle who gets these electoral votes. That commission gave those votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and it then became apparent that he had made a promise that he would withdraw federal troops from the former Confederate states where federal troops had been stationed since the end of the Civil War. This was considered the end of Reconstruction. It was considered the opening of the worst of the Jim Crow era. So a very, very important election, a disputed election. And I'll just say one more historical point about that. Hayes only served one term in office. Many times, several times at least, when there have been disputed elections in our history. John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, William Henry Harrison are the best examples. They've only served one term. There's an air of illegitimacy about these presidents who don't win the popular vote, because through most of our history, the popular vote has determined the president. It's lined up with the electoral vote. Now, it didn't happen. It only happened 2 times in the first 200 years, but now it's happened twice in 16 years. And that's why there are really, really some questions about what we can do about this electoral college, which is clearly not serving the interests of the people anymore.
And once again, black people are at the forefront of that. And the last time it happened was Gore Bush, right? Bush, George W. Won not the popular vote, but the Electoral College because of Florida again.
That's correct. It came down to a decision by the Supreme Court in 2000, of course, that gave. And speaking of that, 3 people who worked for the Bush campaign to overturn those votes now sit on the Supreme Court.
Are you kidding?
I am not kidding.
Please tell us who these 3 are.
Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, and the newly appointed and confirmed Justice Barrett worked for Bush campaign in 2000.
And now here they are. Oh, my goodness. Go ahead, Drew.
That's exactly. Listen, whenever somebody pulls out a whiteboard and a chart that says follow these people and their history and their money and all of these things that they have done together in the past, I just like, wow, if we had the context for some of this stuff, we would think about so much of this so differently.
Come on.